Hello everyone and welcome to our Q4 Pulse webinar. Last week the industry got together for the latest CAP Forum meeting and I have Nick France, CTO of SSL, and Tim Callan, Chief Experience Officer here for you today to update you about the latest industry trends and developments. As always, we're recording this presentation and I'll share it with you after the webinar. If you've got any questions during the presentation, we love to hear them. Please pop them into the chat function and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. And with that, I hand you over to Nick and Tim.
Thank you very much, Leah. So to Leah's point, on October 3 to 5th of this year, we did have one of the 3 annual face-to-face meetings that the CA Browser Forum has. The CA Browser Forum, of course, is the industry standards body that puts together the requirements for public certificates and enforces them and sets directions for the future and all sorts of things like that. And there's constant activity that goes on year-round with lists, mailing lists, and bulletin boards and phone calls, scheduled calls. But 3 times a year, a lot of people from the industry gather together in a room somewhere in the world. This one was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which you see a picture of there, in order to have I'd say a high bandwidth conversation about important issues that need to be hashed out. And it's always a very productive and oftentimes very interesting meeting. And so Nick is a regular, as am I, and we were both there, and we just wanted to brief you on some of the developments from that meeting and in general in the industry today. Right, Nick?
Yep, sounds good, and good afternoon, Tim.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I jumped right in. So there's 3 things I think we're going to focus on today. There was a lot of discussion, as there has been in general in the industry, about reducing the lifespan of certificates. And that's something that we definitely need to get into. Also, MIME is new, right? There are new MIME baseline requirements. You may have seen this from some of our earlier webinars that came in on September 1. And so now, as of this meeting, we were basically a month in. That's enough time that people are starting to see how things are going and maybe how things need to be adjusted. So that's another thing we needed to touch. And then one of the big things that goes on at the CA Browser Forum is that a lot of the work that goes on is future-facing stuff. It's not something that's going to happen in the next month or the next quarter, but it's very influential about what the industry will look like in a year or 2 or 3. So some of these new directions are also extremely important for us and the industry, and there are a few things that are worth calling out here. So short-lived certificates. Obviously, this has been a much discussed topic.
It has indeed. I think you and I have talked about it a few times before, Tim, and it's certainly been one of the big questions that I've heard from customers and various groups. I think even in the past few weeks, I've done countless presentations and seminars and things on the topic. So I think it'll be good to give everybody a bit of an update on where things stand and where the direction is that we're all heading in with these short-term certificates.
I agree. So a little bit of background on this first point, 90-day certificates. I don't actually have this in the slide, but earlier this year, in March of this year, Chrome announced on a page that it maintains that it's committed to getting the duration of 90-day certificates, of leave certificates, SSL certificates, down to 90 days. And at the time, this was the first that anyone had heard of that. Obviously, there was a trend for shortening certificate lifespans, and we figured that 90 days was coming. But that was the first time that someone had really brought it up and said, this is a real thing that's on our roadmap and we're moving on it. And so Nick and I went into this face-to-face curious what the discussion was going to be. And here's my capsule summary of it. Chrome was very clear in reaffirming its commitment to the concept of a short-lived cert, of a 90-day cert. They did not talk about a specific schedule, which is what we were really curious about, right? Because a lot of people were curious about that. They did not talk about a schedule. They said that this is the future. It's happening. We're still committed to that. And I would say the attitude, and jump in if you agree here, Nick, is that they're in a mode of listening and understanding and fact finding. And while they're 100% clear on the goal, on the what, they're working out the how. You think
Yes,
that's right?
I would completely agree with that, Tim. I think and certainly you and I think a lot of other people kind of went into this meeting with, it wasn't a solid chance, let's say, but I think some of us expected there to be some kind of announcement from Google, whether it was a more accurate timeline, whether it was even as far as a CAB forum ballot proposal, and that didn't happen. But as you said, what they absolutely did is it wasn't one of those things that was mentioned at the last meeting and then glossed over in this one. It was absolutely mentioned, and their commitment to do this was absolutely reaffirmed. They said, this is still something we are going to do. But as you said, Tim, I think what they have understood is that this is something that perhaps will take a little bit more time than they have anticipated. Yeah. They gathered feedback. I mean, there was a survey that they had all CAs fill out with regards to their moving forward together policy, which obviously included this and some other changes we might talk about in a short while. And they've obviously taken all that feedback on board, and probably a lot of feedback from other parties as well. I would imagine that, whether it's some of indeed our customers, maybe even some of the listeners now, potentially would have reached out to Google to express their opinions and how they feel this change was going to impact them. So I imagine they're processing a lot of that, as you said, and that's basically left them not in a position to say this is going to happen on this date, but certainly for them to reaffirm that it is something that they are going to do in the future.
And if I may build on what you just said, Nick, one of the things that I like about this is I like this attitude of major root programs being in listening mode and wanting to understand the market's reactions to their decisions. And so, the Chrome page we referenced earlier was called Moving Forward Together. And it's this page that they maintain where they kind of telegraph their ideas and their intentions. And they do it on purpose so that, number one, the industry can prepare, but number two, so that the industry can respond. And it's working, right? They got exactly what they wanted, and they are getting industry response to that. And I think it's very healthy to have root programs that want to gather data from the market about the moves they plan to make. And this isn't always how it was. Once upon a time, root programs would go off in secret rooms, they would make decisions, and they would roll out decisions. It was a fait accompli with no chance for modification or discussion. And, with a large, diverse global ecosystem that so many people depend on, I think this new method that we're seeing more root programs take on is fundamentally healthy. And I'm glad to see Chrome doing it.
Well, I completely agree. And I think just the title of their document, the fact that they published this policy document and that they could, have the word together in the title clearly suggests that they understand the gravity of some of these changes, and they want to solicit feedback, and they want to make sure that people are, they're all ready, they're all prepared, and they have that feedback. But I think on the other hand, in my experience, certainly, and speaking to, customers and groups and lots of other people, is yes, they should absolutely be gathering feedback. Yes, they should absolutely be working collaboratively with everybody. And I completely agree. That's a fantastic thing. But that shouldn't also be used as something to kind of slow things down, right? They have still reaffirmed this goal and this commitment. This isn't we asked, people said it was going to be challenging, so we aren't going to do this. I think we also need to be clear that didn't happen. This isn't a decision they're going to change their minds on, they are going to back down from, because we all know that it is something that will be a net positive, a net benefit to everybody. Although I think we all admit that there could be some hurdles in getting there. So it is good the way they've done it. I agree with you, Tim. It's definitely something we should appreciate, that they are at least this time, well, not this time, but at least now prepared to gather this feedback and to listen to a wider audience and understand the impact of the decisions that they make.
And I think this is typical of the contemporary era Chromium project as opposed to even a couple years ago. And it's just great. It's a positive development. It's going to make the industry better. So now the other thing that we saw that I certainly thought was worthy of note is that Apple, the major, obviously a very major important root program, basically chimed in to add its support to the same concept. And they didn't have something specific except in far as to make an unambiguous statement that this is important to them also. And so, we're seeing root programs aligning behind this idea.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember what happened the last time we did this, right? So the last time there was a change down from 2 to 1 year, there initially was a ballot, and this leads partly into why Google phrased their policy document the way they did, and they said either a ballot or a policy change.
Keep talking. I'll fix the problem with the slides.
Google originally proposed a ballot for 2 years down to 1 year in the CAB forum. The ballot was voted on by everybody, and ultimately it didn't pass. I think there were only a very small number of CAs that voted for it, and so it didn't pass. And then what happened several months later, it was Apple that stood up at one of the CAB forum meetings and said, we are implementing this change as part of our policy. This is the effective date, and it was done, by their decree essentially, and that became the de facto standard. It didn't need the CAB forum vote. Google have been clear that that's what they plan to do if it comes to it, or when it comes to it. But I think it is interesting that we now have another major root program like Apple who have said they are interested in here.
Yeah.
Does that mean that they're going to do the same thing? I don't know. I believe that, as we've just said, Tim, the trust stores, the trust store operators, the browsers, they understand the gravity of this kind of change, but at the same time, they are all agreeing it is something they want to see happen. So I think it'll be interesting to see if anything comes from Apple in the future.
If you're going to go there, I believe that either of these root programs is willing to pull that trigger if that's what it comes to. I
completely agree.
I think that they would prefer to have the CA browser forum agree as a body, and that's what they're going to try to do first. But I think either one of these is willing to force the matter if forcing the matter is required. So, but
Absolutely.
it's not just leaf certs, right? So the other thing we're seeing now a very concerted effort to limit the duration of roots. So historically, a root could be any time span at all, no limits on it at all. And things like 20-year roots or 30-year roots were common practice.
Absolutely a thing. Yeah.
Right. So both Mozilla and Chrome, starting in 2024, will be enforcing a limit of 15-year term for roots in their stores. And Chrome also made it clear that their goal is to get down to 7. Now, again, no timeline on this. That's certainly not going to happen in the next year or two. But they're going to drive to get down to 7-year roots. And this is for a lot of the same reasons as the leaf certs, right, Nick?
Yeah, it's basic, hygiene and common sense, quite frankly. And the less time something is out there, if something goes wrong, and agility is absolutely the big one. But I think one of the reasons this hasn't been possible before, of course, is that software historically used to be very slow to update. You might not get a new root installed in something for several years, and then you would have to wait for everybody to manually run a Windows update to get it to work. This is 15, 20 years ago. Nowadays, of course, browsers, be it Firefox, be it Chrome, be it your iPhone, your Android phone, or your Windows or Apple laptop, those things now update on a much, much faster frequency, and much more easily than they used to, and much more automatically. And so it's only now, I would say, really, that this can even be a goal, right? Because the way this works, for everybody that's listening, is we as a CA have to have our new roots included. So we have to go through a whole process of generating them, having them audited, and then we have to apply to each of the root programs, even if we already have roots in there, and say, can you include our new ones, and here's why, and fill out lots of forms and answer lots of questions. But ultimately, the root programs decide how how long that takes, and then they give the nod, and that starts to be included as of a specific version. So I think this is also an indicator that particularly Mozilla and Chrome are trying to get that cycle a lot faster, and they're trying to make, I think, some kind of commitment to making sure that routes can be, included and updated much more faster than the current process, so that we can actually all adhere to this. Because this isn't a change like we would have to make for 90-day that we enforce on our customers. This is more of a change between ourselves and the trust store operators, right, Tim? This is something that we have to deal with Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Mozilla.
Yeah, like ideally, nobody who uses a Leaf cert has to do anything different, right? Ideally, we take care of that, and that's the drive.
Yeah.
And then just as part of this whole trend, obviously, we'll get to this more with the S/MIME conversation, but prior to September 1, an S/MIME cert could have been any term because there were no rules, right? You could issue a 10-year S/MIME cert if you wanted. We didn't, but you could. And starting September 1, the maximum term for a public S/MIME cert is 3 years, and there was discussion of how that is going to move down to 2 years. So again, the same trend in all of these things: certificate lifespans across the board, regardless of type or use case or where they sit in the trust infrastructure, are shortening. This is the new normal, and we all have to get used to it.
It's agility, Tim. I think you hit on it then when you said the word a few minutes ago. Agility is the key here. There's lots of reasons for it. Again, you and I have both talked together and independently about a list of the reasons why it makes sense. But I think ultimately doing it for all the different types of certificates just makes us more agile. I know it's not something that's necessarily on the agenda today, but we talk about this quantum apocalypse and quantum computing. That's going to be the big one that's going to change everything and will impact all different types of certificates equally. Yeah. And so having agility, whether it's a 90-day server certificate, whether it's a 1 or a 2-year S/MIME, or whether it's a 7-year route, that agility is going to be important across the board. I mean, I think it's one thing I would say on the S/MIME one, though, and we'll talk more in a minute, is that I don't necessarily see that going down too much shorter. Perhaps there will be a 1-year term eventually only, but the 2-year one is I think Apple and other programs that really care about S/MIME, I think they're admitting that going much lower is probably not practical at the moment, simply because the amount of automation for S/MIME is not quite nearly as good as like we'd see in the server certificate world with things like Acme. But also the adoption isn't quite as widespread either, right? So there's less reason to force S/MIME down to 7 days than there is for server certificates, and they have slightly different use cases, of course, so that's going to make some impact there as well.
Right. Yep. And we'll get into more on the S/MIME stuff. In fact, let's get into it right now. So S/MIME, as I mentioned, as of the meeting date we were a month into it. Now we're 6 weeks into it, and so there was definitely stuff to be talked about. The first of which is I referenced the 3-year term for S/MIME. The only way you can even do that now is you need to use a profile of S/MIME called Legacy. And to be clear, there are 3 different what we call profiles. One of them is strict. Strict S/MIME certs can only be used for email, for signing and encrypting email. That is all they are okay for. The second one is what we call multipurpose. Multipurpose can be used for email, but it also can be used for things like authenticating identity, allowing access, signing documents, other uses that S/MIME certs are commonly applied to. And then the third one is what they call legacy. And legacy is even broader. And this is used for things like smart cards and other things that are further outside of the center of the target. And the 3-year term is only allowed in a legacy profile certificate. But the legacy profile was always viewed as an interim thing, an interim measure to give organizations an opportunity to update their processes and systems to the point where they could live without these certificates, or move to a private CA, or move to a different kind of cert, or something else. And so we began the discussion. of the fact that legacy is going to be deprecated. And this is something that the SMIME working group is going to go work on, that legacy is not permanent and that we need a time frame and a plan for the deprecation of that certificate type. So when that happens, per the previous slide, that will de facto reduce the time for SMIME. It's also generally going to be a forcing function for these use cases that are pretty far off the ranch to move to a more appropriate either CA, like an internal CA, or certificate type.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Tim. I think that's really the crux of the matter is that, well, there were two use cases I remember. Number one, there was a lot of talk about this legacy profile. People wanted 3 years where they were using SMIME certificates in hardware. Yep. Smart cards, for example. But I think you're right. I would almost go as far as to say a misuse of this type of certificates in many cases. Certainly I've seen where what is ostensibly an SMIME certificate is being used for something else. It's being used for authentication. It's been used for some kind of signing that isn't to do with SMIME. And that's not to say it necessarily shouldn't be, but it's not really the right use case for it. And you're absolutely right. Removing this legacy profile is going to at least start the discussions, if not as far as forcing those users of SMIME that were using them for anything that wasn't signing an encryption of email to the SMIME standard, make them look for other things. And I think you nailed it there when you said about private CAs. I commonly see what we might call an SMIME certificate be used for authentication, which is really not the best place for it to be used. It should be a private CA dedicated for authentication, where you're not subject to the kind of the whims of the CAB Forum SMIME working group and their changes.
Absolutely.
So it's really moving away from
your internal system. It's your internal certs. You're the decision maker. That's a private CA use case. Yeah, it's interesting how SMIME just over such a long period of time migrated or expanded, I should say, from its original intention, which was signing emails, to all of these other very different things. And now, the industry is going to have to try to lasso this, and that's going to be a little bit of work. And this is the next step in that, not the last step. But
that speaks to the lack of requirements that only really came along, right? We had a similar situation many years ago before the CAB Forum and before the baseline requirements for server certificates, right? It was a similar level of Wild West. And these standards came along to standardize everything, to make sure everybody was doing things the same way, and then use that as a kind of progression towards sensible use of the technology, quite frankly. To make sure that in another couple of years, perhaps less, all SMIME certificates will be used for SMIME only and not for this myriad other things.
Yep, and part of this getting everything under control exercise is that there will be a new set of web trust audits. So public CAs who are issuing SMIME certs now need to get audited for web trust. So this is brand new. As of today, I'm pretty confident that 0 CAs have been through a web trust audit for public SMIME. So this is now going to be part of the new world. And just as the audit firms and CPA Canada and the CAs and the browsers have had more than a decade to work out how the BRs and web trust audits align with each other. And even though pre-BR web trust audits go back several decades, now we have to figure out all of this for SMIME. So this is going to be a big thing the industry is paying a lot of attention to. Like what we said earlier, excuse me, shouldn't really affect users of LEAF certificates that much. No. But it's a big focus for people inside the CA community like Nick and me.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the thing you just said about affecting end users, I think the next bullet point is actually kind of an interesting one, and it speaks to the other two things we just talked about, right? Which is historically these certificates were used for a lot of different purposes.
Right.
Now it's being standardized, and what we've certainly seen, and I think the rest of the industry is starting to see, is there's cases where the certificates aren't being used for what they're supposed to be used for, and we're seeing that crop up in these the use of what they call pseudonyms, which is supposed to be a pseudonym to represent a natural person, but is often being entered as some kind of non-human name for a system or something else. And it's things like this that we're starting to see as a result of having standards.
I mean, you can understand the need for a pseudonym. Like my name on my birth certificate is Timothy, but I go by Tim. So I want my SMIME cert to say Tim Callan, not Timothy Callan. That is a pseudonym, right? And it could be more pseudonymous than that, like, Bob for Robert, or, Betty for Elizabeth, or it could be super, super synonymous. Maybe you go by a nickname that has nothing to do with anything. Maybe everyone calls you Lefty, right? And so in that regard, they have a very valid place, and we do need them. However, when we start seeing certificates registered that are just a string of numbers, a string of numerals, or a string of hexadecimal, or something like test user, then this is getting into territory that we didn't really originally anticipate when these BRs were published. And so everybody's going to have to work this out. And this can be tricky, right? Like, there's no law that says you can't name your child test user. It is possible that there's a person with the name test user. So we can't just declare that test user is not allowed. And so in that sense, there was general agreement that the working group's got to go away and think some hard thoughts about this. And we don't know exactly what form that's going to take now, but that's something that will be coming.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's just the general thing here for anybody that would potentially be impacted, because this is one, is to fundamentally look at how you're using SMIME certificates, right? And if you are using them and putting, non-human names in there, or even things that couldn't pass as pseudonyms, now would be the time to start reassessing that and perhaps reach out to whoever you work with to figure out if there's a better way to do what you are trying to do.
Right, exactly. And then lastly, a bunch of CAs now suddenly are following BRs where they never followed BRs before. And as you would expect, errors are happening. And so bugs are being written up. CAs are writing up on the bugs on themselves. Other people are writing bugs up on CAs. And this is just a thing that's going on. And sometimes they're errors. Sometimes we've written up a bug that wasn't an error, but we think the BRs were wrong. Right? So that kind of thing is going to happen for a while as all of this stuff settles and consolidates. And to your earlier point, Nick, no different than when the BRs rolled out, a decade ago. It was the same thing. It's just now we're 10 years in and all that stuff is much more stabilized.
It's flushing out the non-standard use cases. The ones where they are potentially abuse cases, and the ones where they are things that perhaps the guidelines didn't think quite
and
well enough about.
Out the stuff that we all thought was probably right on paper, but suddenly you start using it in the real world and you realize, oops, right? And this happens. This is fine. This is normal. It's the normal process. It's just going on now, right?
Absolutely.
So that's it. So SMIME was a big one. Some of the new directions, this is possibly the most interesting part of this webinar, I think. Some of the most new directions to watch are, these are 3 things that Nick and I pulled out as certainly very likely outcomes, impactful outcomes, and good outcomes to know about. So the first of this is that Chrome has announced a root program requirements change, where as of January 15th, 2024, for any new root to be included in their program, that CA must support automation.
Yep. And this was mentioned in the moving forward together, right? But this is now coming out as a
and
it's a requirement, and it's coming soon, exactly. And it's, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but the policy is really going to kind of trend towards ACME for CAs to have support for, but it doesn't exclude other automation technologies, APIs and things, because obviously that would not make a lot of sense.
They specified that it was not required that it was ACME, but they stated what we all know, which is it probably just should be ACME. Like, if you're going to do the work anyway, you really ought to do ACME. And this
You
is
may as well do the
important.
best standard for it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the most, and yeah, and just the most accepted standard, right? The standard that's going to work with the most operating systems and servers. And so what this is, I mean, this is huge, right? This is very important, I think, because Chrome has been telegraphing their commitment to automation for a long time. And one of the reasons that they've been pushing for shorter certificate lifespans is the desire to drive automation. That's one of their reasons. Certificates are safer is the biggest reason, but there's others. And at the same time, this is the strongest step we have ever seen them make by a long shot.
Mhm.
And so this is throwing down the gauntlet saying, here's how it goes. You're going to support automation, or you are not going to play in my environment anymore.
Yep. I mean, it is absolutely one of the strongest. I agree with you there, Tim. But
Yeah.
it's also, I would argue, one of the easiest for them to make, because unlike the billions of users worldwide with billions of certificates that they don't really have any direct interaction with, they have a direct line to every CA that's included in their program. You know, they can call me, they can call you, they can call anybody at any of the other CAs. And so it's relatively easy for them to enforce this because it's a much smaller group. It's a group they have to have regular interaction with.
Yes.
And as you've said, it's a requirement that they've really been telegraphing for a while. And I guess I would argue as well that most CAs who are issuing any number of certificates, I'd say, on the public internet, through the web PKI, as we call it, publicly trusted certificate, will have had some kind of automation for a long time anyway. And if they haven't, it should be something that was on their roadmap to get out very
Chrome
recently.
shared some statistics on this, right? It was, and I don't have these in front of me, but the gist of it was that something in the ballpark of 80% of the CAs in their program support automation, and that more than 99% of the certificates that are issued, that are public certificates in the world, are from CAs that support this automation. Now, that doesn't mean that they all, that although that 99% of certificates are automated, right? But it means that the CAs support automation, which is one of the key roadblocks to automation everywhere. And yeah, I agree with your point, and I think this is Chrome's point as well, is they're just, this is table stakes. If you can't do this, you're not suitable to be a public CA in today's web PKI.
Yeah, completely agree with that.
Right?
Completely agree.
And you just got to be able to get this done.
This is their way of making sure that happens, and making sure that when they do make a change down to 90 days, that everybody's CA, whether you're, you know, a customer of the biggest CA or the smallest CA, that the automation options are required to be there and available for you to use. Because, you know, 90-day, we all know, isn't really practical at scale without automation anyway. So this is Google's, you know, other hand, making sure that the CAs are ready for this change, even if perhaps, you know, all the end consumers are not quite there yet, making sure they can be.
Yep, absolutely. So that's important. Also, to be clear, there was no discussion of deprecating existing routes. This was more a requirement for new routes. So if something like that comes, that would be later. That wasn't something they brought up. The next one, removal of OCSP as a requirement. So little background on this. I think we talked about this in an earlier Pulse, but earlier in the summer, the CA Browser Forum passed a ballot removing the requirement for OCSP checking from the BRs, which means that there is no longer a CAB forum level requirement for OCSP checking. Now, this is following on for several of the major root programs to remove that requirement as well. There presently is one root program that still has that requirement. And they were pretty clear in communicating their intention to get away from that. And again, we don't have a timeline, but when that occurs, what that does is that frees up CAs to look into two other options, one of which is CRL-based revocation checking. And that's a very different animal, and it involves strategies around sharding and segmenting your CRLs and things along those lines, or issuance of very short certificates. And the other proposal that's out there floating in the world is that certificates of 10 days or fewer in duration wouldn't need any revocation checking at all. And so
Yeah.
this is a possible future that we see very short-lived certificates with no revocation checking, where the natural termination of the certificate's lifespan itself is the revocation enforcement mechanism, right?
Exactly.
And yeah,
I've been saying that, you know, when we've been talking about this, I've been saying that's Google trying to give us as a CA and potentially users as well a kind of incentive, right? To say, hey, look, if you can issue certificates as short as 10 days, you don't have to put the revocation information in there. And the incentive from a CA perspective is these revocation services are big. They operate at very high scale. You know, they can be costly to operate, and they can have sometimes impact on the customer in terms of having to check that revocation, or the certificate is a few bytes larger than perhaps would need to be.
Privacy concerns.
Yep, absolutely.
And they have, in some ways, they've been likened to a seatbelt that breaks when you get in an accident, which is that if OCSP is going to fail, really the only time it fails is the time when you need it. And so when you put all of that together, it's a good idea, but it's a technology paradigm that is definitely on the wane. And so I'm going to predict that perhaps as soon as a year from now, probably not quite that soon, but certainly by 2025, OCSP will be optional, and the requirement will come about.
No,
so
I think I agree. I think it's something that's going to be, you know, gradually disappearing, and we're already starting to see the moves towards that. So I think that'll be a net positive, I think. Yeah.
Right. And while OCSP fades, something that is waxing is multi-perspective domain validation, MPDV. Nick, you were the first person who told me about this. You're where I learned about this concept. So
yes, so this was
us.
Well, I was invited to do a workshop at Princeton almost 12 months ago now on this, because some of the key researchers into this are based at Princeton, and they've done a lot of work into this. Basically, what it is when we issue a certificate, we have to verify that the requester actually has control over the fully qualified domain names we put in that certificate. And obviously, to do that, we use the same protocol we all rely on to function on the internet, which is DNS. And as hopefully everybody knows, DNS has its flaws and its weaknesses, let's say. And it is a protocol that can be subverted. As we've got here in the slide, it can be really subverted using these things called BGP attacks, Border Gateway Protocol. And ultimately, it's about subverting the actual routing protocols the internet uses that tells packets of data where to go from here to here. And what it means is there's a potential to conduct an attack, and these attacks aren't particularly easy to pull off, but they still can be done practically. And they can effectively get a certificate issued from a CA for a domain that isn't really controlled by the requester. So obviously a certificate can be misissued. So the plan really, and what these researchers and a couple of CAs...
That's done by subverting domain control validation. So I advertise that I control a domain that I don't actually control. I fool a section of the internet into believing me. If I happen to fool that section of the internet where the CA is, then it goes and let's say looks at my DNS record, but it's not really looking at my DNS record. It's looking at the false DNS record. And in that way, DCV could be subverted. And if DCV is subverted, of course, now I can get certificates for domains I don't control. And that is definitely a cardinal sin in the world of server certificates.
It's a bad thing. Yes, it's a bad thing. So you're absolutely right, Tim. That's pretty much how it works. And there's not really a whole lot of prevention you can do there. There are some things that the internet providers who talk to each other and do this routing can implement, but that takes some time. So one of the big defenses that CAs can put in place is this thing called multi-perspective domain validation. And hopefully it's pretty self-explanatory, but basically when we do these checks and we say, hey, do you own timcallan.com, please prove it to us, we can actually perform that check from multiple perspectives, multiple locations across the internet.
Yeah.
So not two people on the same server, for example, but from one data center and another data center, another data center. And
Different
assuming all of those things
geographies and,
agree, you check it from as many perspectives as you can, and assuming all those things agree, you can go ahead and issue the certificate. But if there's dissent among those things that you're asking, then it's cause for concern, and you should block issuance and maybe investigate. So it's really about having to implement that. And I use it's probably a terrible analogy, but if anybody's seen the film Minority Report, where they have the three people who can see into the future, they're supposed to not take any action if one of them disagrees. And it's a very similar method. You check from multiple perspectives, and if there's a disagreement, you don't issue. So this is going to be something that is going to be required as part of the root programs, and Google are requiring it, and it's a good thing.
It's not a matter of if, it very much is a matter of when and how. And the how part is very important. And they were very clear on this, which is, okay, what's our definition of multi-perspective? How many perspectives do you need? How much separation do they need? How do you measure separation? And these are all questions that need to be discussed. And these things need to get worked out, and these need to be built into codified rules that are measurable, where you can look at it and say, yes, we met it, or no, we didn't. And that work must be done before an MPDV requirement can be rolled out, and that work is in front of us. So there is definitely some work here. But I agree with what you just said, Nick. I do not believe it is even in question that this will be a thing that we must do. I think it's just going to be a function of how that gets worked out.
Absolutely. There are a few finer details to be worked out, like you said, Tim. I think this is one of those few changes that I think could have some minor impact on some users, purely for the fact that one of the requests we do see from time to time is people asking, essentially, where do we make this check from? Oh, I have a firewall and I need to make sure that this check's allowed, or I do something strange with my DNS service and I only answer to certain territories, for example. And those kind of things are going to have to stop, obviously, or they're going to be stopped from issuance if they don't fix that. So it's a very minor thing, and I think it'll be something that we'll communicate more when we get to a place where this is near to be rolled out. And as you said, there's a few things that need to be ironed out before we get to that stage. But it's one of those things where people who run particularly sensitive, like DNS services, or do things that are a bit out of the ordinary, there might be some minor impact there. But it's just really, we're just making things safer. It's the same as pretty much everything we've talked about. This is all to increase the safety of the web PKI, of the internet, and of what CAs do. And it's just going to be another thing that we're going to have to implement.
This is just how it goes, right? Like I talk about this a lot with a lot of people, but it's never done. It's constant. There's always people finding new attacks or new vulnerabilities, and then there are responses to those. And this is the normal progression of computing platforms and networked computing platforms for as long as I've been in this business, and this is going to go until you and I retire, right?
Absolutely.
And beyond.
But I think it's good that I think it's good that we as an industry are doing this now. Historically, we have been a fairly slow industry to adapt to these things. And again, as I often say when we do these kind of talks, we are pretty critical to the way the internet functions nowadays. And so it's good that we are making these changes more rapidly, even if we are being forced in some cases by people like Google, which you and I agree we're quite happy to be, because they know what they're doing. But at the same time, it is good that we're seeing these new changes and we're seeing these improvements to adapt to new threats that keep us on our toes, basically.
And if you look at this one, the MPDV, and also the automation support from the top bullet, another sort of trend that you see here is, in general, the expectation for technical acumen and performance for a public CA also continues to increase over time. And there is, I think, recognition that there's a certain set of technical table stakes that you have to be able to meet, or we can't let the public rely on you.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think that's something that hasn't happened before. And I think it is good that we are now at a stage where people are making sure that the CAs that ultimately pin up the security of the internet are being held to a higher standard. And I think that's a good thing, and I'm sure we agree.
I agree with you. All right, so some deep dives on this. We kind of glossed on some of these things. We gave you the general description, but there's a lot more detail. If you want to learn about any of these topics, we have webinars that, one of these here was recorded by Nick and me. A couple of these was recorded by me with another of our associates, Henry Lamb, and we can give you whole webinars just on these topics. So if you want to know about MIME, if you want to learn about 90 days, if you want to learn about certificate discovery, or a bunch of other things, go to sectigo.com/resource/library/webinars, and they're there for you to find and view on demand. So if you want to learn more about any of these topics, you can do that, and we'll go into more detail than we did today. As always, if you did enjoy this conversation, I'm going to invite you to the Root Causes podcast. The Root Causes podcast is something that I co-host and create along with another associates of Nick's and mine, Jason Sirocco, and we publish new episodes every week, and most weeks we publish 2 new episodes. We have more than 300 episodes covering all different aspects of PKI and digital certificates, digital identity, and CAB Forum and CAs and stuff like that. And come listen to us and learn about lots of different topics that are interesting to us. So we'd love to have you join us. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Great, thank you both. We had a couple of questions through. The first one is, what are the reasons for reducing certificate length to 90 days?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Tim. I mean, I think
Sure.
we touched on a few of the reasons when we discussed it. I think the primary one is that it ultimately makes everybody safer. I mean, when a certificate is misissued or in some way misused or perhaps vulnerable, say a key is compromised, then the shorter that thing exists, the better, the less time the window for abuse for that certificate. So reducing that lifetime is good all round for security. But I think the other main driver is what Tim and I touched on in terms of agility as well, is shorter certificate lifetimes is going to make people look at adopting automation, having to adopt automation, which means changes can be adopted much, much faster. We've seen some changes in the past few years in our industry, things like moving from SHA-1 to SHA-2, and that was a fairly critical change to make, but it took quite a long amount of time to actually make because people had to catch up, and there were 3, 4, and 5 year certificates out there that people didn't want to change until they expired. So having shorter lifetime certificates makes us as an ecosystem a lot more agile and therefore a lot safer. So it's really ultimately about security and safety, but that comes from people being agile and from being able to adapt to these shorter lifetimes and changes much, much quicker. Tim?
Yep, and as you mentioned already earlier, Nick, that this whole thing is going to get accelerated when we have to move off of the RSA and ECC algorithms onto the new set of post-quantum crypto algorithms. So at that point, that need for agility just gets that much greater.
Yep.
Great. Then the next one is a bit of a longer one. Chrome stated that it did not have a set schedule. Many businesses operate on the idea that if there's no date, there's no project, and it's hard to explain to the business that we need to address this concern or reach automation when it's not locked in yet. So the question is, has Google provided an idea on how long they will give businesses time to react to this change once they've formally announced it?
If we look at previous certificate term reductions, once the formal announcement has come, we've all been given a year. That seems to be pretty well established. So for major changes like this, or like the MIME BRs, we got a year. The 2 year to 1 year, we got a year. The 3 years to 2 years, we got a year. So when you're looking at major, smaller changes can come much quicker. But when you're looking at major changes like this, there seems to be sort of an accepted norm that the announcement will come 1 year before the actual requirement will come. So hypothetically, if they put forward a ballot tomorrow, it could pass by the end of the year, and we would probably get until, let's say, January 2025, right? I don't think, and you can weigh in on what you think, Nick, I don't think that a ballot or a root program requirement is a year away. I think they're going to be driving on this. And And so then if you say there's a year to adapt, I think we're looking at a 2025 requirement, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, Tim. I mean, I know, you and I have talked publicly and privately about dates before, and it's the common thing that people ask most when it comes to talking about this change. You're 100% right that historically we've generally seen about a 12-month period between the announcement of a date and the actual enforcement of that date. And given what we've said before, which we both agreed on, we think Google are very much listening. They're very much cognizant of what this change, how impactful this change is. And so I think we're looking at least a 12-month lead time from whenever they do that. But I do absolutely agree that it's going to be something that is going to happen fairly soon. So it's going to be, again, I think we're right. I think we're both kind of agreeing now on an approximate time frame in early 2025, which would suggest that sometime early next year, there's likely to be either a ballot or a policy change that says, hey, it'll be about 12 months. But to kind of answer the question, Leah, I think what was generally there's about a 12-month lead time, we believe, but there hasn't been any official timeline stated by Google. I think we agree we wouldn't have them turn around and say, hey, this is going to happen in 3 months' time, or this is going to happen in 6 months' time.
They're not going to do that, right?
No, it's going to be at least a year from whenever that happens, and we kind of think that the change will be announced probably at some time, I don't know, in the next couple of quarters, maybe.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, great. Next question is, what implications does the root limitation to 15 years have for businesses?
I think the businesses, not really a lot. I mean, as we said when we discussed this is largely a change between us, the CAs, and the vendors, really, and it's how quickly they can update their software to incorporate the new routes, because we can actually produce new routes fairly rapidly. It's historically that when we do a new one, it can take several years for the powers that be to agree to that and then push it through their internal processes to finally get released in software. So that's a problem between us, the CAs, and the trust programs, and that isn't really something that affects businesses. There will be some businesses where they may do one of two things, I would say, two technical things, and these are fairly rare, but they do happen. Number one is where any device they control, an enterprise or a business might choose to artificially restrict what root certificates are in there. So rather than relying on what Apple include or what Microsoft include, they may have made a decision to curate that root store themselves. I would perhaps suggest that isn't the best idea unless you're actively updating that on an almost monthly basis. But those kind of businesses might be impacted. And the other ones would be, where they aren't updating things very frequently, or where they are doing something called certificate pinning. That's the other thing. So that's where not only are you using a certificate and verifying that it's in date and it's for the right domain name and so on, but you're also doing additional kind of out-of-band checking to make sure the certificate you see is the right one you expect. Certificate pinning is very risky, especially for public certificates. It's something that we certainly advise against. I think most big CAs advise their customers not to do it. I know I've had some stern words with some in the past. So it would impact any business that's doing certificate pinning. And if that's something you have a concern about, then absolutely reach out to us. I will happily tell you not to do that and advise you in ways to kind of start to move away from it, or alternatives if you feel you need to. But it's really only going to be larger businesses that are doing one of those two things. So that's controlling the root store themselves or doing certificate pinning.
Right. And then a question on the SMIME topic. If I'm using the legacy profile and eventually it's going away, what do I do once it's not allowed anymore?
You got to use a different certificate type to do that. So the defined use cases, you can do things like sign your email and even sign your documents using a strict or a multi-purpose profile, and there's no discussion of multi-purpose going away anytime soon. If you want to do something that's, again, much less standard, like embedded in hardware, and for that you're using the legacy profile, you need to use a different kind of certificate. You need to be on a private root, or you need to be on a non-SMIME client certificate. And these are available. Like, these are well understood technical paths forward. It's just that a lot of people have been using S-MIME for these purposes for a long time. It's built into a lot of systems and software and process, and it takes time to change these things out. So if you are using legacy profile and that is in your environment, you should probably be working on your action plan to get away from it, because it is not going to last. And there's time, but get started now and it won't be a crisis.
Yep.
Okay, and another S-MIME one. Why does CAP Forum feel it's important to put these regulations on S-MIME certificates?
Because
Well,
they're part of the public trust. Like, at the end of the day, it's the same reason that they did the BRs. Sorry to interrupt, Nick. I know you were going to say
no,
something.
I was going to say the same thing.
Right. Once upon a time, web server certificates could be anything because there were no rules. And that was problematic in the day because there were no rules. And how did you know you could really trust these things? How do I, as a consumer that's going to a website and seeing a lock icon, know that that's trustworthy? How do I, as somebody who operates a web server, know that I'm getting a CA from somebody who's trustworthy? And putting those rules in place was the first step in getting there. And like we said, 10 years later, 10 plus years later, we're still refining that, right? But that was a very important first step. And the same thing was done for code signing. And it took this much time to get around to doing it for S-MIME. But if you want to really see a signed email and count on the fact that the name in that signed email is the authentic person who sent you the email, you can't do that unless there's some kind of reliable minimum standard or baseline, if we will, requirement for what is done with that certificate.
I was going to say the same thing, Tim. I think you touched upon the point there that I was going to make, which is we and other public CAs are publicly trusted, as we call it. So a certificate that we at Sectigo issue will be automatically trusted by every single Microsoft device, every single Apple device, every single Google device, and many more on this planet. And the people that make those devices, they represent the users. They are basically saying, we trust Sectigo to make sure these certificates are issued correctly and represent the thing that they represent correctly. And without having some kind of defined standard, they can't really be reassured that we do that. And so having a standard that says this is how you verify someone's email, and then I will make every single Windows user on that planet accept your trusted email certificate as being correct and valid, then they need to be able to do that, and there need to be standards to do that. I think you put it very well, Tim, when you said, having a baseline of requirements that everybody should have to meet, pretty much like in any regulated industry.
That's a good phrase. We should use that somewhere.
Great. So I think we've gone through all the questions. There were a few duplicate ones that touched upon the same topic, but I hope we answered all of them. Thank you everyone for your time, and thanks Nick and Tim. If you've got any more questions, do get in touch with the Sectigo team directly. We've got more webinars coming up throughout the remainder of the year, so also keep an eye on our website. And yeah, we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.